When you look at macroeconomic objectives, there are some. Number one is price stability, keeping inflation low as possible. Like when you look at inflation, we saw in AS inflation has a cost. For example, inflation can result in a country exports to become expensive, imports to become cheaper, expansion can go down. Uh, Also, you will see that inflation can have an effect in terms of like shoe leather costs, menu costs, redistribution costs, competitiveness, and so on. So keeping inflation low is a very important macroeconomic goal. Uh, Keeping inflation low will also lower uncertainty and improve investment in an economy. So all of this results in us to have a stronger economy if the inflation is under control. What's the desirable rate of inflation that we want to keep? Less than 5%. Anything less than 5% is desirable. Anything between 5 to 10% is okay, but less than 5% is basically desirable. Then comes, guys, full employment. Second key objective is full employment. Why is full employment important? Because of course you are using resources fully and efficiently. We saw cost of unemployment. Cost of unemployment were many. Remember, we talked about how the standard of living can be lower. We talked about how a country may not be on its PPC, will be below its PPC, may have a long-term implication in terms of crime and so on and so forth. So keeping unemployment low or achieving full employment can be another macroeconomic goal. Third one is, guys, balance of payment equilibrium. So using flexible exchange rate, remember we said balance of payment may automatically balance to zero, but in reality, you may need to keep your balance of payment to not go into a deficit. What are the issues of having a deficit in your current account of the balance of payment? And we said there were many issues. For example, one big issue is this, that if you run into a balance payment deficit for a longer time, your reserves may run out. Remember, foreign reserves will run out, or your currency will be weak. All of this could be a problem. Um, Next up is economic growth. Remember, there are two kinds of economic growth. There is actual versus potential, and potential versus actual may basically you trying to make the AV go up, right? While potential economic growth is basically long run aggregate supply curve shifting to the right, and economic growth can result in unemployment to go down. Economic growth can result in also economy to have a higher standard of living. And so these four, we've done this in AS as well, with the four macroeconomic goals: your balance of payment equilibrium, economic growth, price stability, and your full employment, right? But there are some other goals as well, which we need to consider. One is environmental consideration, like whether the economy is achieving growth, but at the same time having more pollution, more environmental degradation, like having sort of more externalities generated and all that. So environmental control is another goal that we may consider and if you look at developed countries now care more about environmental consideration than they were probably in the 1800s. If you look at China, for that matter, one of the arguments people raise is that China is achieving significant economic growth at the expense of, for example, pollution. When they were hosting Olympics, they had to close factories for 30 to 40 days to make sure people can have cleaner air or better quality air quality when they participate in the Olympics. So Beijing, factories around Beijing were closed for 30 to 40 days so that the air quality improves. So that's the downside of it. Also, some resources are what we call non-renewable. If you use them, you may not leave them for your future generation. So these are also something we need to consider. Then comes income distribution. Income distribution being fair is another goal that many economies may want to achieve. Some people may disagree with it because the argument of equity versus efficiency is raised, where a lot of people say that efficiency should be promoted over equity. Equity is basically are the distribution of resources more equitably distributed, and efficiency is basically are we giving more to the one who is doing more. So there is always a trade-off, but the idea goes is that through, for example, uh, progressive taxation, or through, for example, unemployment benefits, social security benefits, we may try to achieve what we call more fair income distribution. Next up is basically, guys, correcting market failure. What are the various market failures? I'm going to talk about this next week when we talk about market failure and government intervention. But some market failures could be, for example, externalities. Another market failure could be, for example, guys, your monopoly power, or for example, your what we call merit and demerit goods and public goods. All of these are market failures, and correcting that could be another goal for an economy. And lastly, guys, is productivity. Economy, we want to sort of increase productivity. And remember, productivity also makes the LRA shift to the right. So the idea goes is that if you are more productive, your exports may become cheaper, you are more competitive in the market, your LRAs may shift to the right, and so on and so forth. Make sense? So these are some of the macroeconomic goals that we need to consider. The four that we, the four are the more important ones. The next ones are also important, but we give more focus to the first four, which is balance of payment, inflation, economic growth, and what was the fourth one? Unemployment, keeping unemployment low. Um, I want to talk about exchange rate policy. We haven't talked about this, and I think uh, there is a discussion that happened in AS where we talk about exchange rate more so. But here I want to talk about that. Just like supply side policies, we have demand side policies. Then we have also an exchange rate policy. And there's a trade-off in exchange rate policy, because if you have a floating exchange rate, yeah, guys, if you have a floating exchange rate, then you don't need to manage the currency. But if you have a fixed exchange rate, there is a problem that happens. Why? And I'm going to explain this idea that, let's say exchange rate is down and you want to bring it up. Okay, you want the exchange rate to go up. How do you do that? Well, you can make the interest rate to go up. If the interest rate goes up, hot money or short-term monetary flow flows in, right? When hot money flows in, demand for pounds will go up, supply of pounds will go down, and that will make our exchange rate to go up. Isn't that true? So one way of making the currency become stronger is basically through interest rate going up. And vice versa, by the way, if you want the exchange rate to go down, how do you do that? And the answer is make the interest rate go down. So if you have a fixed exchange rate regime and you want to make the currency to exchange rate to go up or down, you use interest rate as a tool. What is the problem of that? The problem of this is that you do not then use interest rate for anything else. Interest rate for us is a very powerful powerful sort of tool to manage AD. Like if the AD is going down, how do you make it go up? And the answer is you can make the interest rate to go down, and AD will recover. Vice versa, if the AD is going up, you can make the interest rate to go up and AD will fall. So it's a very important tool, which means it's a monetary policy tool. But if you have a fixed exchange rate, you have a choice. Either use it to manage exchange rate or you use it to manage your AD, but you can't do both. Does that make sense? So there's a trade off. One at a time. And by the way, what other ways can you make the exchange rate change? And the answer is you use reserves, buy and sell currency. But problem is country like Pakistan. There was a very good article telling us that country like Pakistan, who doesn't have reserves and yet want to manage their currency, normally use interest rates. And currently they have used the interest rates to be really low, which means hot money is flowing out of the country. Isn't that true? Which will result in what? Which will result in the exchange depreciation to happen. So you try to achieve depreciation sometimes through this manner. Make sense, guys? Sometimes you may want to appreciate. Sometimes you make the interest rate go up, significantly make the exchange rate go up. You know. So in considering the tool for monetary policy, it is also important to consider the exchange rate policy. This is the rate at which the currency exchange against another. This is because the exchange rate, the interest rate, and the money supply are all interrelated. Uh, if interest rates, uh, if interest rates in the domestic economy, if interest rates in the domestic economy are high relative to elsewhere, they will attract overseas investor. This will tend to lead to an appreciation in the exchange rate. We just talked about this. Hot money will flow in, which in turn reduce the competitiveness of domestic goods, reducing the foreign demand for exports. So expansion will go down, but your exchange rate will go up. Under fixed exchange rate regime, the monetary authorities are committed to maintaining the exchange rate at a particular level, so could not allow an appreciation to take place. In this situation, the monetary policy is powerless to influence the real economy. Why? Because it's trying to make the exchange rate managed, which means you're powerless to make the real economy to be managed, as it may be devoted to maintaining the exchange rate. Under the floating exchange rate system, monetary policy is freed from this role. Like this is the advantage of a free floating exchange rate regime, that your monetary policy is completely free. You can use it. But even so, it must be used in such a way that the current account deficit or the balance of payment does not become unsustainable in the long run. Which means that if you're using a floating exchange rate regime, you can't really feel that you are free to, because you might have a current account deficit for a long term. And if you have a sustained or continuous current account deficit, guys, why is that bad? Your reserves may be running down. So somewhere or the other, you might need to sort of intervene. So in other words, the use of interest rates to target inflation has implication for the magnitude of the current and financial account of the balance of payment. If you use interest rate to manage AD, you might not be able to use that for your exchange rate, which means there's always a trade-off that exists. So exchange rate policy is basically either we want to have a fixed exchange rate or a floating rate, and if you use fixed or floating exchange rate, it may have an impact on the interest rate, because somewhere you might need to take one and not other. Most developed countries operate under a floating exchange rate regime, unlike developed countries. But many less developed countries like Pakistan have chosen to peg the currency against dollar. Pakistan doesn't do that, but Pakistan tries to do what we call a managed float. Every now and then, like Pakistan under Nawaz Sharif government, if you remember, was stuck at 120, 120, 125. Everyone was like, wow. As soon as they left, it just jumped up to 165 or went down to 165. And the argument that they said was this was artificially maintained. And the government was trying to artificially maintain it either by reserves or by interest rate. And if you remember, in the Nawaz Sharif government, the interest rates were pretty high. So that was a way to make the currency sort of manipulate. Exchange rates in this context have always been used in different ways. Some countries have chosen to overvalue their exchange rate relative to the equilibrium. Why do you want to overvalue your exchange rate? Make your currency stronger? Exports will become expensive, imports will become cheaper, which could have an advantage. Your inflation can be low. But others have chosen to reverse it, like undervaluing the exchange rate. China has been much criticized by the US in their context that China devalues the currency. Makes sense? So, guys, there's always a trade off when you use exchange rate as a tool. So, that's one thing. Okay, quickly, let's look at some of the conflicts between policy objectives. So, this is a very popular exam question. I mean, not a popular, but it can come, which is that one of the trade off we talk about is basically inflation and unemployment. Remember the Phillips curve?
Yes.
So chapter 8 talked about Phillips curve, which is trade off between unemployment and inflation. And remember, this trade off exists in the short run, but not in the long run. In the long run, according to the classic monetarists, this may not happen. So a reduction in inflation is likely to result in higher unemployment. This suggests it might be difficult to. So if you are making your look at this, guys. If you're making your AD curve, if we are making our AD curve to go to the right, you may see GDP to go up. What am I doing? I write AD here as well. So AD curve to go to the right. So you may see the GDP to rise, but the price level will also go up. So there is the problem is this higher GDP, which is economic growth, will have an issue with price level, or lower unemployment will have an issue with price level. So economic growth, uh, unemployment has a trade-off with inflation, or similarly, economic growth has a trade-off with inflation. Why? Because there could be demand pull inflation that can happen. You can do supply side policies, but the problem with supply side policies is that supply side policies happen only in the long run and not in the short run. Then there is another trade-off, which is economic growth and sustainability. And we've seen this, by the way, that you know there is issue in, for example, China. China's persistently rapid growth has had consequences of the quality of the environment. In the case of China, there are several aspects to notice during the process of industrialization. Uh, they use up a lot of energy supplies. There is a lot of air quality issues. There's pollution that is happening, and if you factor all of that in, the cost to the environment is more when it comes to sustainability. But right now, do they care about this? And the answer is probably not. Probably in 20 years, when they realize that probably they may want to sort of focus on, so, they may want to sort of do that then. Make sense? Uh, so for economic growth to be sustainable, there's an argument that environmental effects must be taken into account, as there's a real danger that improved standard of living that flows from the growth process will be obtained only at the expense of quality of life. You may get people to become richer, but they might be living in a condition which is not really healthy and so on. Make sense? Next up, guys, there's a problem with economic growth and the current account of the balance of payment. What is the that argument? The argument is that if you're achieving sort of economic growth, so a country which is operating under a fixed exchange rate defined economic growth strategy, basically GDP to go up, right? But GDP may have a current account or a problem to happen. So if there's an increase in real income, guys, people find their GDP to go up and the real incomes to go up. One of the biggest problems that happen is this: that a rise in GDP may be accompanied by a fall of sort of a rise of imports. People may end up buying more imports, which would mean this would mean basically your current account may run into a deficit. This, by the way, may not be true for developed countries, but developing countries may बहुत मसला आता है. This problem in developing countries is this: that whenever there's a rise in real income resulting from economic growth, there will be an increase in the demand for imports. They will want to buy more foreign cars, more foreign goods, more tourism, and so on and so on, so forth. So there is a current account deficit that happens because of the rise in GDP. In the long run, of course, when you become a developed country, you have a strong exports to to match the strong imports. But for a country like Pakistan, that may not be the case. Does that make sense, guys? Any questions? Okay. This we can skip. I'm going to talk about policies, micro policies, and then we'll talk about macro policies as well. So I'm done with the topic. So now we go on to the last topic, which is government intervention next week, inshallah, and then we'll take it from there. Okay, I will send you the topics which are important um, by Sunday. Okay, thank you guys.